Okay, so everyone's been incredibly punctual today. So we can welcome you to the latest in the series of the LSA's Thursday talks, which today will be exploring whether the title of an architectural assistant is inherently demeaning and how agency might be increased for those in training. My name's Ruth Lang and I run the critical practice module at the LSA, which reflects on current practice and future opportunities for bringing greater equity to the profession. I'm very happy to be welcoming our LSA alumni, Zafir Ameen, with us today, whose work explores issues of agency, exploitation, and self-worth within this very complex topic. Zafir actually graduated from the LSA last year and now serves as an educator at Open City and as the professional practice programs producer at the LSA. And calling upon his many years of experience as an architectural assistant himself, Zafir will be seeking to help equip students with the right tools and knowledge to ensure fair treatment and wages in practice. Contextualised within the new real living wage, new Pay 100 results, and the current onslaught of social political issues, it's paramount that architectural assistants are truly valued and compensated. Zafir began this research within the critical practice module in his first year, which is one of a spectrum of many different themes that our students explore as part of their practice study in the module. They seek to help gain deeper understanding of how a practice's aims and ethos can be enhanced through the critical reflection that the students undertake as part of their placement at the LSA. And as ever, we'll be inviting you to send us your questions. We're really looking forward to some interesting discussions to wrap up this session at the end of lunch today. So Zafir, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share screen. Hopefully you can all see this. Oops. Cool. Hopefully that's all full screen. So hello, yeah, thank you so much for attending this talk. I'm happy to see there's quite a few familiar faces, I think, from both undergraduate and masters at the LSA. As Ruth said, I think I'm going to try and speak for about 30, 40 minutes, hopefully in the shorter side, so we can have quite a long Q&A and discussion, because I'm sure that lots of you on the call will have plenty to say on this topic. I titled this, You're Just a Part One, because I truly believe you can't address many of these systemic issues of agency, exploitation, and self-worth without first addressing this initial barrier. And having studied for 3 years, being a part one or architectural assistant can no doubt be an empowering and rewarding experience. But where this falls short is when the title is weaponized and used against students, where even the assistant suffix can undermine your work. And I myself have heard countless times of people using it against students, saying you're just a part one, you're not expected to progress, and just unhelpful comparisons of how much worse it used to be back in the day. So as we will see throughout this talk, these comments do nothing but alienate the future of our profession. So I just want to give a little bit of context. I think I know quite a few of you, but just for those of you that I don't already know, just super brief background to who I am and why I'm doing this. So I completed my part one at Manchester. I went on to work in practice for a few years, and then completed my part two at the LSA, as Ruth mentioned, while working, because that's the setup that you have when you're a student at the LSA. So in total, I worked as a part one for 4 years, 2 years full-time, and then 2 years part-time. And then after finishing my part two, I was already pretty disgruntled, I think, by practice. I wanted to pursue some work in the charity sector. So I recently joined Open City as an educator, and I helped deliver a range of programs to students of various ages, from about 8 to 18 plus, actually. And then I also returned to the LSA 1 day a week and usually facilitate this program. But today we'll be giving a talk myself. And I guess my final responsibility is as a student rep on the RIBA Council, which I guess is especially topical depending on what we're going to be discussing later. But there's a few slides of how hopefully that can be interwoven in. And if any of you have any questions or concerns, hopefully we can set that straight and help you get what you deserve and what you're worth. And when I first started architecture school, I think it's definitely safe to say I didn't expect to work for 3 different charities. But all my work is to the same end, to improve access in education and ensuring fair treatment of the profession. While I was a student at the LSA, I think it became apparent pretty quickly that numerous people, both students and professionals alike, were not properly taught the difference between minimum and the real living wage, let alone how much they should be paid. So it slowly and somewhat accidentally became my personal mission to change this. And every year I sent quite a biblical email to all the LSA students to inform them of their rights and their minimum salaries. And it started out something like this. There were some brief definitions that went into some tables for guidance on how much you should be paid, depending on, a few variables, which I'll touch on later. And I guess this talks became the natural evolution of this. And I'll go over these definitions again later, and the figures that have now been updated with the latest guidance that's come through. And I guess the last piece of context worth noting is what Ruth mentioned before, is that this actually then became the subject of one of my LSA module, which is the Critical Practice Manifesto, which asks students to interrogate various forms of practice. And yeah, I chose to do mine on the architectural assistant and the issues of exploitation. And on the cover, and actually for the marketing also, was this diagram, which I created that kind of, in my eyes, distills the image, I think, quite clearly. And it's an interpretation of systems thinking, which is based on an example that Kay Raworth herself used in her book, Donut Economics. So really quick segue that if you haven't read it already, I would highly recommend. It's got extremely rich content and super useful diagrams, but it also has like a really broad range of case studies and references. And in this book, Kate explains complex system thinking through a really simple example of chicken and eggs. So through growth, eggs obviously hatch, they become chickens, and through reproduction, these chickens go on to lay more eggs. So this, in terms of systems thinking, is a reinforcing loop where it amplifies the population. The more eggs that you have, the more chickens you will get in return. So hopefully that makes sense. But then there's always often a variable that balances this. So in this case, chickens crossing the road. So unlike the previous loop where the more chickens you had that crossed the road, the lower this population will be. And this is referred to as a balancing loop. So this obviously reduces the population. So when you put these two together, this is kind of a holistic vision of a systems loop as defined by the book and by other theorists like Donella Meadows, if any of you have read that, would also highly recommend, if not. So in this, I guess, example, obviously the amount of eggs that you have reproduces, you get more chickens, and it's balanced by the number of chickens that cross the road, which ultimately controls the population. But the size of these two loops is what's really important, and that's where you get complexity, as it can tip the system out of equilibrium. If you have more chickens crossing the road than are obviously being produced, then the population will decline. And this, I think, is obviously quite extreme, facetious example with chicken and eggs, but I think it does actually apply quite easily to architecture, because I think you can really clearly see that through a reinforcing loop of education. So you go through training, you become an architect, architects in themselves become role models. This will amplify the population. So this is the reinforcing loop, which in theory will, keep generating a higher population and turnover of architects. But conversely, this culture of exploitation is undeniably the balancing loop, and the side of this, it causes so many to change careers and ultimately to exit the profession, which I'll be honest, I think I'm seeing which I think we're all seeing a slight increase of, especially recently. And I think crucially for architectural students, it's also tied to this culture of exploitation. So it's not just architects that maybe go through this, it's actually a direct link. I don't know if you can actually see my mouse, but a direct link between assistants being exploited. So where previously maybe there was balance between an equal number of people joining the profession and maybe an equal number of people exiting, there definitely are like a multitude of factors that are kind of causing people to leave and ultimately discouraging people. And yeah, I think creating a quite a big loss of architects that come out the other side fully qualified. And I do really think this is like quite a catastrophe in itself, because we are actively deterring and inhibiting our own profession by kind of scaring away all the architectural assistants so early on in their careers. And I think some people like invariably dispute this, and a culture of overtime is quite a strong term. But there really is like already quite a lot of evidence to how rampant it is. I don't know if any of you have read this article. It was in 2021. It was an AJ article based on the open letter and the survey that the Future Architects Front FAF did about taking aim at the profession, and they also quoted a culture of exploitation. And this was just one of the many results and tables that they produced. And yeah, as you can see, I mean, it's 74% of people felt that they were exploited by their practice. And this was, I guess, in 2021, I guess, kind of in the midst of still COVID repercussions, but still an astoundingly high figure, which I think we should be doing everything in our power to reduce and mitigate at every cost. And I'm sure you've all heard of FAF, but if not, I thought I'd just quickly like give them a quick shout out for the work that they do. And actually the co-founder, Charlie Edmonds, now teaches critical practice as well at the LSA. So another, I guess, interwoven link. And the LSA students in particular, who I think are on this call also, will have hopefully a bit more exposure to their work and their activism that they do. So I guess I kind of split this talk into a different, I tried to, cover a range of different things, and I had to think what I kind of wanted to do with it. It's a little bit different, I guess, to the conventional Thursday talks where practices kind of highlight a topic and use case studies of building. This is more, I guess, an educational journey, something like that, to kind of get everybody, I guess, clued up and know their rights. Um, and I guess there'll be a lot of information, but I have tried to distill it as much as possible, and there'll be hopefully a lot of diagrams and definitions. And by the end, I'm hoping that everybody will be able to know the difference between the wages, to know their rights, and just to understand some baseline salaries. And arguably more importantly, just know where to go for help, because I think it's not something that's necessarily taught actively, and lots of people don't know where to find this information. So yeah, my ultimate aim is to make sure that everybody feels empowered and actually knows, where they can look or who they can ask if they are in doubt. So what do you need to know? So I'll just quickly outline some definitions and some rights that you have, and we'll just go through these really quickly. And again, there'll be some diagrams and some figures which will hopefully explain it a little bit better than the words. Uh, so the key distinction that I think is really important to make is the difference between the national wages and the real living wages. And some of you probably know this already. I think there are a few architects on this call as well, but I know that there are so many architectural assistants that don't know the difference. So as a super quick overview, the national wage is the legal minimum that people must be paid across the UK. And I guess emphasis on the legal minimum and must be paid, which can be broken down a little bit further into the national minimum wage and the national living wage. So the differentiation that the government does is an age-based thing. So if you're below 18, you're entitled to a set amount of money. If you're at the higher end and 23 plus, then you'll earn more. But ultimately, the overarching definition of the national wages is that they're legal minimums that you must be paid. And by contrast, where it gets a bit confusing is slightly similar wording, but it's the real living wage. And the key distinction is this is a best practice. It's the minimum that people should be paid. And it's defined by the Living Wage Foundation, who I guess openly acknowledge that the government figures are quite low and it's not enough to survive. So they produce their own figures every year, which are significantly higher. But again, a best practice, not legal in any sense. And their distinction between their work, their output, sorry, is not based on age, but based on location. So this is actually quite a big difference. So there's um, the best practice wages if you're anywhere in the UK, but there's a specific figure which is London only, which is significantly higher, as you'll see soon. So just to summarize, the national wages are the legally must be paid, and that is again differentiated by age, whereas the real living wages are what you should be paid, but that is broken down by region instead. And I guess in practice, to make it a bit more visible, is the figures are quite different. Like even if you go quite a few years back, I think this is 5 years of results that I looked at. Even just looking at this year's, the national living wage for anyone is £10.42 per hour. But if you're in London, it's significantly higher. It's £13.15 now per hour. And while that may not maybe seem like that much of a difference, if you say work a 40-hour week, that's £5,000, more than £5,000 difference per year. So it really is important to understand these and to know which, I guess, category you fit into, because yeah, it could mean the difference between vast sums of money. And I guess the good news and the bit of extra thing to note is that if you work for an RIBA chartered practice, your practice is obliged to follow the code of conduct. And in the code of conduct, there's a clause which states that all practices must operate with the real living wage. So that's the higher, I guess, optional in theory wage. But if you work for an RIBA chartered practice, the real living wages are no longer best practice; they're mandatory. And it does apply to all staff, which I think is also really good. It's not just reserved to architectural work, because if you have technicians or any other assistants, I guess, of any kind, they all, I guess, fall under this umbrella protection. So again, maybe just to make it super clear, this is I guess flowchart I created was just a way to navigate how you would find out what you should be paid. So the first, I guess, question to ask is, do you work for an RIBA chartered practice? If the answer is yes, the only distinction you really need to know is it in London or is it in the rest of the UK? And that will kind of direct you to the figure you need to refer to. And then if you're not an RIBA chartered practice, then you essentially are appointed to the national wages. And the difference there is just based on age. But since most people, I guess, come from university, this will pretty much be the same figure without much distinction. But I think this, yeah, is a good overview in my opinion, and hopefully will, yeah, if you're stuck, will help navigate you to the right category, I guess, of pay that maybe you're entitled to. And I think another reason that I chose to do this talk at this particular time is stuff has changed recently. Only last week, the London living wage increased, but the national wages change every year in April, according to the financial year. So if you're 23 and above, the hourly rate, absolute minimum, is £10.42. But yeah, literally last week, I think it was the 24th of October, the London Living Wage published their results, which again is the higher, in theory, best practice figures. And the UK rate is 12, which is already higher than the £10 that the government sets. But if you're in London, you're now entitled to an extra bit of money, and it's £13 15 that you get per hour. And I guess just looking at that change over time, it is quite like significant. Again, I looked at, I think, the last 5 years or so that the changes happened. And so from the, I guess, £10.75 that it was, the increments and the rate of increase is quite staggering. It was less than 1%, it's almost 2%. Then it jumped to 8 in the, I guess, somewhat rise after COVID, and now it's at 10%. There's a 10% increase in in real living wages over just the course of 1 year, which, yeah, I think speaks for itself in terms of how high priority this is. So I guess, yeah, the best way then to kind of understand is to look at, yeah, once you've figured out what category you are, the hourly rate, I just like compile this table to kind of outline, where you sit on that. But then maybe more importantly is to then apply it annually over a week. And again, when you do the maths, the differences in figures is, I guess, quite substantial. And again, makes it super important that you know which category you fit into, because then you know what's contractual and what kind of figures you are entitled to. And if you work different hours, of course, or less days per week, you'll need to factor this in. This was just assuming 5 days per week, 40 hours total, 52 weeks a year. But yeah, these are the figures that you can, I guess, use as quite useful metrics, depending on the hours and days that you work. And I guess the caveat and the important thing to note is that it does not include overtime. So obviously, if you do work overtime, you should be obviously entitled to more. I know that most practices don't do super extensive toil policies, but these figures are based on doing the core hours of just 40 hours a week. And I think this comes on to my next point, which is that even if you're not a part one, these updates are truly just as important to you, if not more important. So I just set some examples. So say that you're fresh out of uni, a London part one at a chartered practice, you're doing your 40-hour week. You're now entitled to £27,352 as a baseline straight out of uni. But then if you do at least 1 year out, you'll obviously need to be paid more for that experience you've learned, and you've probably maybe stayed in that same practice. And then now maybe you've completed your master's. So that's another 2 years of value that you need to add on top of the real living wage of 27K. And if then, for example, you finish your part two and then you're asking for something in the low 30s, I just put 30 because it was a nice round number. I think then it's easy to like calculate or try and work out what are you valuing your experience at and your master's at. If you are now if fresh part ones are entitled to 27,000 and you're a part two in practice at the lower end of 30, you can easily work out the value you're applying to your years of experience and your master's. So I guess it's just a stress that even if you're not a part one, you need to proportionately add or work out the value. And obviously that's quite a difficult and subjective thing to do, but by just making sure you understand where the goalposts, I guess, have moved for minimum, it also affects you at your banding, whichever, I guess, role you are. So it's just to make sure that you are like proportionally asking for something which is maybe in line with your experience. I guess lots of people have asked, I got lots of messages, I think, when the new national wages were released about what a good figure was for part two. And again, it's really difficult. It's so subjective to decide. I mean, so many practices do different types of work, different, like from high end projects. But I think 35 upwards is not that bold an ask now that 27 is the part one minimum, because you're valuing at least your 2 years of experience plus however many, sorry, your 2 years of masters plus however many years you've done working out. And if you're an LSA student in particular, you've also been working while studying. So you can also factor that in. And I'm sure there are also lots of other courses where people work alongside, like Sheffield Collaborative. And these are all things that I think you can take on board and should use in your negotiations moving forward. Um, and I know that some of these figures will seem quite bold, and I'm sure there might be a little bit of pushback on some of these, but I just wanted to draw your attention to another key resource and a super recent update, which is the Pay 100. So for those of you that maybe haven't encountered them before, they do really great work. Pay 100 is a worker-led organization. They have a website and Instagram and potentially a LinkedIn, I think. And they inspire open wage cooperation. So people kind of self report their wages depending on how much they earn, and then they're kind of added up in this table with the results released. And since last year, I think it started last year was the first year. They've produced an annual survey, and it outlines the pay of architecture practices all across the UK. Um, so in their latest survey results that were literally released yesterday, there are actually only 14 practices that are currently paying above the current London living wage. And I guess the caveat for this is the London living wage did also just come out. So there will obviously be some time for this information to be updated. But the main reason I show this is just to prove that this is the part one like ranking. There are practices that are already paying at the higher end of 20s, if not 30s. And it's just something to take into account. And it really is an invaluable resource that I think you should be using, referring to, and even discussing with your peers. You may even find your own practices on here, and you may realize that figure is not what you earn, but now you have the tools in the agency to, justify earning a little bit more. Um, and I guess it's also important to, again, note something that I mentioned earlier about overtime. So again, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but there is a category that they added this year about the overtime hours per week. So actually, if you factor these in, maybe some of these would no longer actually be compliant themselves with the threshold. But I guess again, it's a little bit subjective because it's self-reported and you're not sure how many responses were given. But I do think it does give quite a good picture of salary overtime, and if you're a part one looking for jobs or a part two looking for jobs, it is quite a good metric and tool I think to use. And I guess again the survey is UK wide, and that's important to note. But there are lots of at the bottom of the list. I think there were 68 entries this year, so 68 is the last. And the numbers go quite low, like almost shockingly low. And again, you have to factor in overtime and where they are in the UK. But some of these definitely do work below national living and national minimum. And this is something that you can push so strongly because, again, national wages are the legal minimum. So you should definitely not be paid under that. And you can lobby your practices and institutions to pay you more in line with the higher end of the table. Oops. And the part two listing, I think, is slightly more promising. If like the figure that I was looking at of around 35K, there are a number of practices that already pay quite highly above that. And again, the new real living wages were recently updated. So actually, this list is a little bit historic, which I guess is like the RIBA pay scales. They're reporting obviously the year previously. So hopefully soon, in the next iteration of the survey, or rather quickly, these figures will actually go up even more, and hopefully a number of practices will increase above 35K, and there'll be more than 13, which will be treating paying part ones quite a lot more. And again, it's UK wide, so that's also something to note. And I guess the arguably most important section is about what you can do, because I've kind of shared all the, I guess, key figures and the numbers, but doing it like in principle, that's all fine. But actually being able to do it and negotiate is extremely difficult. And I've had firsthand experience of this. So I'm going to quickly show through some things that you can maybe do and some tips to, I guess, ensure that. And then I'll kind of end on, I guess, a case study of what I guess happened and how I negotiated and how we worked as a practice. So unions, I think I appreciate it's maybe something that some people, I guess, yeah, I don't know if there's like a stigma against it, but I think some people feel very strongly about unions, maybe rightly so, I don't know, but there's quite a difference of opinion, I think, but I can't stress enough that it really is one of the best things you can do. Um, Either by joining one like UVW SAW, which is, I guess, specifically obviously for architecture workers, or even starting a designated union at your practice. Um, you do receive enhanced legal protection as a union, and you get union reps that can attend meetings, that you can go for advice. And yeah, there's just so much more agency and I guess bargaining that you can do if you have a union, either part of like a larger one or there's one in-house in your practice. And you can just encourage like higher transparency. You get maybe, yeah, more open things like policy. Maybe you get pay banding, accessible to everyone. And yeah, I guess the power of collective bargaining really is not something to be taken lightly. It really is such a powerful tool. And if you've been, I guess, watching any of the stuff recently with like the train strikes, the doctor strikes, they all, as I guess, inconvenient as they are to people, they work. There's a reason that mass walkouts or mass unionization does get the results it requires. So again, heavily stressed that this is super important. It's something that you can do to yeah, to really go quite far. And I guess if you do decide to create an in-house union, this is another, I guess, maybe slightly lesser known reference, is the IWGB. They're an independent workers union for Great Britain. That's the acronym. And they have a range of different subgroups. So actually, it's not just architectural workers. They represent quite a substantial amount of industries, actually. So that it's equally useful for anyone outside of architecture as well. At Open City, we have a union, and that union operates under the, I guess, the charity arm of this institution. But again, yeah, a really helpful resource, and would recommend checking out if you haven't heard of them before. And I think I mean, I flashed up these images before and tagged like how you can find them, but I really think you should also make use of the resources and the work of organizations that already exist. I mean, FAF famously does already call out job adverts and posts them and sends them back to the RIBA, people that underperform, and the pay 100 again is such a useful metric to help you negotiate and determine a fairer wage. So I really think you should, yeah, be using these in every sense that you can to help just benchmark at the very least where you stand. Um, and I guess in terms of the RIBA, it gets a little bit more, let's say, technical, because RIBA charter practices again have to comply with the code of conduct. And depending on the severity, there actually is a complaint procedure that you can use. So the official advice, as I guess screenshotted here, is that you try to deal with everything obviously in-house at the lowest level possible. So let's say you have an issue, you think you should be paid more. The first point of contact would be your line manager, for example. You go to them, you say, the living wage just increased. I am entitled to earn this. It's part of, the RIBA code of conduct, etc. And hopefully something will be done about that. And then in the case that it's not, as per the advice on screen, you can escalate this internally with, I guess, increasing, well, not increasing severity, but I guess an increased level of the practice to hopefully get your voice heard. Maybe you have a HR thing internally or a studio manager that you can talk to about this. And then the last, I guess, final, almost nuclear option is you can actually report this. If nothing is done and you're, let's say, below minimum wage, there is the possibility to contact the RIBA. They have the professional standards team. And again, as this last sentence says, you can discuss this matter further if you do think you're, yeah, not being treated fairly. Because again, shadow practices do have to abide by this, because by being chartered, they are automatically signed onto it. So I put this email down at the bottom if you do need to go this far. But again, you should work it internally, I guess, from the lowest level upwards, rather than going straight for the nuclear one and hoping for the best, because that may not turn out so well. But just to reiterate this point, like this is from the AJ article I showed you earlier in 2021, which was the FAF survey. The president at the time, Alan Jones, like thoroughly backed this process to raise issues such as these, and actually mentioned like a range of things that you could report it through. like again, raising to the relevant authority, but again, the nuclear option, but you can and should report it if you're being completely unheard and it's not, I guess, going well within your practice. And I guess, as I mentioned before, I am the RIBA student rep, so I do, like, by definition, represent the architecture students of the UK. And the point of that is to voice the concerns and opinions. So if you have a question that maybe it's, I don't know, you don't want to ask, you don't feel comfortable asking someone in your practice, you don't want to, I guess, yeah, go nuclear and email, I guess, the official professional standards email. You can email me at any time. And I can either discuss it with you or escalate this internally, because that is essentially the whole reason I ran for nomination. Pay is something that well, everybody should be super invested in, but I guess I have a particular interest in just making sure the treatment of everyone is truly fair. So it is literally the sole reason I stood for election. So please do not hesitate if you have any questions. Um, and I guess the final thing that I will maybe add before moving on to the final slide is, yeah, just the example, because uh, I know again that it is really hard to do this, and negotiating about pay is a taboo subject at the best of times. But again, collective bargaining really does get you so far. And where I used to work, as like part one, we got offered a flat percentage increase for inflation, and people were just not very happy. It was quite low. Um, and there was some pushback and people voiced their opinions, but ultimately for a short amount of time, nothing got done because it was individuals, I guess, kind of reporting it, which, I mean, maybe is fine, but it was kind of bubbling under the surface. Um, so what I decided to do was kind of, I guess, unite everybody, and we all kind of discussed and we set up, um, I guess, first through email chains, but then through like a formal group. We all came together. I guess union is not the proper term because it was not, I guess, a registered trade union, but we really did all come together to agree a set of principles. And we use collective bargaining. So one thing that I did, and if I think there are some LSA alumni on this call, I sent messages to all the people I know to be like, how much did you get paid? Just kind of benchmarking again. And that really is a powerful tool. So we went around asking, oh, did you get an inflation rise because cost of living is so high? Did you get something extra? So we spent a few, I guess, weeks, I think, collecting information, kind of building our case for it. Because again, sometimes um, going completely nuclear and shouting, or even just, going straight, you must pay me this, will obviously just generate quite a negative response. And yeah, sometimes the louder you shout, the less people listen. So we kind of gathered our evidence for quite a while. And then we had a presentation. We sent an I guess we sent an anonymous email from like an atoll email through our studio manager, which went to the wider practice. Well, went to the directors, but copied in everybody. And it was kind of just a set of principles of things that we just kind of didn't agree with, and the things that we wanted to see. I think what was important was, as well as just highlighting what we disagreed with, was trying to be constructive. So we gave, I guess, a point that we didn't think, the rise we were offered was necessarily fair or high enough. But then we also made sure to like counter with examples. So we think we should be getting X. This is where we sit amongst, I guess, the wider spectrum of practices. We contacted these people. They've had these systems. We could maybe use a bit of that. And I think being constructive like that does really help. Again, just fighting really hard back and saying we must be paid this just sometimes doesn't work. So through that, we had, a series of forums that kind of got their voice heard. People voiced their opinion. Some people did stuff, I guess, anonymously, and other people spoke on their behalf. And yeah, it was, I mean, it worked. It was extremely successful. We got what we wanted. Everybody got a higher raise. We ended up actually doing a staggered raise. So it meant that the lower members of staff, I think it was part one to architect, I think got a higher increase, and then everyone from associate upwards got a slightly lower increase. So it kind of reflected the issue. It was kind of giving the people that would struggle the most and the people that maybe were at risk of being marginalized, more money and more opportunities. And yeah, that was how we did it. So yeah, just again, proof again that it does really work when you do something collectively. And the power of comparing and knowing your sources, being well informed, I think, is one of the main things that I want everybody to take away. And I kind of hope that by the time that as we get to the end of this, that everybody does know the differences. And again, I know that it was so much information, but understanding these differences makes a significant impact. And now that you know your rights as a worker, you should know the minimum salaries that you're entitled to. Um, and the best practice examples that you've seen from the Pay 100 really should help guide you and use it as a metric. You can compare similar size practices. Obviously, if you're a one-person practice, maybe maybe not one. If you're like a three-person practice, it's not fair to compare against some of the AJ giants with a few hundred, but you can find some case studies that can um, point you in the right direction. And I guess maybe I can't have mentioned before, but this talk has been recorded. So if you need to go through this again at a later date, please do. I tried to make the diagrams as simple as possible, and try and distill it so it is really easy to navigate. And please do make use of my RIBA email, because if any of you have any questions or concerns, it is, again, my role to respond to those and to voice those concerns to council, take them to the current people on board, and even the current president, Moiwa. If you're an LSA student in particular, I think feel free to grab me at any time. I'll be in studio. Yeah, I'm in studio once a week, or you can email me. But yeah, I think I'm rapidly approaching 22, so I'm gonna just end because I think it'll be way better to have discussion and hear what you think, and I can see some things in the chat already. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Zafir. And it's been wonderful to see how much your research has transformed and kept growing since you began to look at some of these issues and their kind of underlying causes when you were at the LSA, but also being able to find your own points of agency to be able to help change that system. So knowing that being part of the system rather than trying to fight it from the outside is going to be something which is more transformative. And also just to be able to convey to everyone that, like, although it can feel like an individual kind of battle in a way to try and make sure that you're being paid correctly and valued correctly, that you're not alone in doing that, and that there are so many other networks that you can call upon to help. We've got a couple of questions that are coming into the Q&A, but please add more of your questions there so we can open up this debate even further. It'd be really great to have some of your insights and maybe experiences that you've had from practice. And I know we have some practitioners on the call, so it would be really great to hear from directors as well about, like, are there initiatives that are in place that are helping to overcome a lot of these issues? And are there like particular pressures that you're under that you feel like maybe are causing other hindrances? But on that, so just before we go to those questions, I was just wondering if you did want to speak a little bit more about, like, how these gaps have arisen in the first place. Like, why have we got this situation where people are not necessarily being valued as a part two, and like what other values do you think they need to be able to emphasize as part of that?
I think we might need another talk for that. But yeah, I don't know. I think the system is there's so many factors that kind of contribute. It's stuff that I guess you discuss quite a lot. There's like undercutting of fees. There's so many, I guess, like smaller things that feed into it. But I think if we kind of almost, I don't know, I don't want to say build it from the ground up, but like have a good base, and we start with just knowing how much your time is worth and kind of sticking to it. Like, I think over time in itself, there's such a downward spiral. Like, as soon as everybody starts, doing things for free, then you never know how much time people actually spend doing it. And then that means you're always going to be paid disproportionately. And then that means then the fees are always going to be wrong because you're being paid for hours that you're doing outside of it. And then the circle, I think, just like it completely goes around. So that's why I really do think if we start with being absolutely transparent and super clear at, how much everyone should and must, I guess, be paid, then only we can build up, from there. Because if at the very base level people are not being paid their worth and being paid below both national and real living wages, then I don't think we will get much closer, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's really interesting about how it's systemic, and that we all at various points in our career have agency to help keep changing this system. But like that, having that awareness of what those issues are in the first place is really an important first step to try and help overcome them. And we've got one of the questions that's come through from the Q&A from a member of the audience saying, if the practice is currently paying me £150 per year less than what I should be given under the living wage, is there any point in asking them to pay me the extra, given that it would be taxed and essentially not really worth it? Or is it more the principle?
I guess again, I guess there are so many variables. It depends, I guess, what else, like are you a fresh, let's say, part one or part two, and you're just being paid the threshold, or are you a part one or part two with years of experience? Because then you wouldn't just, let's say, make the threshold. You should make the threshold plus
Mhm.
the extra worth that you are. So even if the 150 is, let's say, nominal in principle, because it might, yeah, get removed by tax, it means that then your next stepping stone is there. Because part of one of the other, I guess, slight issues is that the real living wage is, I guess, updated like now. We're in November, whereas usually salary appraisals and stuff happen in April. So there's already like a bit of a lag sometimes that happens. So I think it's important to try and be as on top of it as possible when you can, so that it doesn't fall out of sync. Because if you only update these figures, let's say again in April, then you're already a year behind again. And that's, I think, that's part of, I mean, I think I got a question personally about the RIBA pay scales, and I do think that is one of the biggest downfalls of that, is that it's obviously historic, and I appreciate it takes a lot of time to collate that info, but it really is looking back in the past, and it's just reflecting on stuff that's already happened. And that's why, yeah, again, you just fall into these broken cycles of, you see a number, you pay that number, but actually you're paying last year's number, and then again
Mm.
we're kind of working against, we're going back already through that,
Yeah,
which is another issue.
no, but I think that's a really good point, and that uh, as well, you're kind of not only looking at your own pay packet, but if you're making sure that there is a greater awareness within the practice that everyone should be earning on these kind of benchmarks, and having a conversation with HR who, like, unless they've been explicitly exposed to some of these conversations, maybe are unaware of it themselves. So you're actually helping sort of nourish and create a sort of very nurturing environment within the practice by being able to raise these things. It's not a combative situation necessarily. It's something which is much more kind of helpful and supportive for everyone involved, including HR.
Yeah, exactly. Because yeah, as you said, it's something that's so obviously specific to an individual, and that's, I think, why it is also it's really important to talk, even if you're just talking to other people you work with. Like, you'll never, I guess, know unless you speak up about it, and that's what's kind of reassuring about having organizations like FAF and the Pay 100, or even in a union, that you get to then share these thoughts and comments and be able to, yeah, know how other people feel and what they're going through, and if there's ways. And like, that's another reason to, like, John, who's the engagement director, told me to share that story about what happened at my practice, because unless you hear it, you won't know yourself how to do it, because it really isn't, I guess, taught to you, which is a bit of a shame, I think.
We've got another couple of questions coming in,
Yeah,
so I'm
of
going to
course.
keep you on the spot.
Yeah.
We said, thanks, Fear. That was really clear. Great to see how you've bridged the excellent findings in your research and channeled that into a constructive, collective voice in your practice to help achieve change. What would be the 3 bullet points of advice that you would offer a part one without a collective within their practice when going into a discussion with their practice of fairer pay?
Um, okay, 3 points of advice that I give a part one about fair pay. Uh, Hmm. I guess again, starting from the very bottom of like the minimum, so making sure you're absolutely clear where you sit, and if you're like, I'm gonna keep using the word fresh, but if you're a fresh part one, that is, let's say, the starting point. You should be at, let's say, X amount, and then try and see what else you provide. Like, are you doing something else for the practice that would give you more value and give you more agency, and put that on top. And then again, I think if there are other part ones, I think speak to them, or part two, speak to like the closest people in the practice. I think it is, I think, more transparent, I guess, at the bottom, let's say, of it, where you can talk and ask, as a part two, how did you navigate this? If you moved practice, were you able to negotiate more? Because I think, yeah, you'll just hear how other people have done it, because it is, yeah, quite specific in each practice. Obviously, again, people review pay differently. There might be banding, or there's like review processes. So it's just understanding how it works within your practice, but still learning from, I guess, the wider profession, and how um how they would do it.
Yeah, and I think a really great point from your talk was about how you built that transparency between your peers as well, that there is a lack of understanding about the mechanism sort of below the surface as it stands. And so helping build that yourself gave you a greater agency as a result.
Yeah.
I got another question about, do you have any thoughts on the RIBA pay scales? And I'm sure you do. I think they are reductive and used as an excuse to pay part ones and part twos poorly, as they do not take experience into consideration. So it's very kind of like binary and a kind of categorization. They would love to hear your thoughts.
I'll be a bit careful what I say, but I do, yeah, I do empathize with that. And I think, again, what I touched on earlier, it's just that I think the fact that it's historic is one of the fundamental, I guess, failings of it. If in my opinion, as an institution, the best thing that the RIBA could do for that is not be reflective, but be proactive and be like, the real London living wage you have to pay because that's the code of conduct. So now going off these figures, if you're a part two, you have to be paid at least X amount. Like I think it should be more guidance, whereas what the pay scales are, and I don't know if it's, I don't know, intentional or through accident, has just become a reflection of, what was it last year. And that's again how you just get trapped in this cycle. Whereas instead of, looking back and being like, in 2022, the part ones got paid this. It should be in 2024, you should be paying your part ones this. And I think that would really help progress because if we keep looking back and relying on the stats of last year, we're never moving. And that's why I didn't even include it in this presentation because it's so different. Like the numbers that are there from the Pay 100 or the numbers, if you do the maths of the real London living wage, are so far off the RIBA. It's because, I mean, there's such a big difference. If there's a 10% increase in the real living wage, like there's no point like almost looking at those pay scales anymore. Like you're already in a different bracket. If there's a 10% change. So that, I think that is part of the issue, and hopefully I can help change that, but we'll see.
Well, you're doing the work at the moment to help with this, but there's also a great comment in the chat that was saying about how it's worth noting that while the living wage doesn't include overtime, the national minimum does, and that they've seen practices that offer living wage on lower hour contracts, but in reality pay less than the minimum on real hours worked, which I think is a really it's like key nuance in ideas like overwork and underpay that we're facing within the sector.
I think
Other
just
questions?
really quickly
Yeah.
on that, I think that's another thing about like being like just knowing the difference of what you're like, the specifics of your practice. Like again, every practice has really different policies, and sometimes some practices do toil at like, let's say 1 to 3, like, or you maybe can get paid for weekend work or whatever it is. Just make sure like being clued up. Like it is sometimes a bit like tedious to go through all of this, and there's so much reading and so much knowledge to go through. But it makes a difference just knowing like what you can be paid. On certain times out of hours is a massive difference when you scale it up monthly or even annually.
As one of the other comments in the chat was saying, like in relation to this, that they know from experience that arguing for a fair wage is both stress and anxiety inducing. Is there any worth in lobbying the ARB to invigilate the process of wages for workers in each practice? This would go towards creating statutory benchmarks rather than cultural benchmarks, and would be enforced by the regulatory body, which is interesting about that difference between ARB, RIBA, and even LSA, but it was also give the IRB something to spend our membership fee on, which has gone up again this week.
I think maybe that's something I should have put in actually, but I guess the distinction to make is that the ARB is not actually for us. The ARB is for the public. The ARB is the public's protection. It's the reason you sometimes see those like scandalous AJ articles of architects being struck off the register for what was it, setting fire to a client's car. Is like they're there for the sake of public protection, which is obviously inherently good, but they're not there for the protection of architects, and that's why I think the RIBA needs to be proactive in that sense to cover that. I think it'd be great if the ARB could have, I guess, more tangible policies and guidance on it, but I think their primary role, and I think they do, I guess, do it. I mean, they seem to enforce it quite a lot, is the protection of public. So I think we just need the equivalent, which is protects us from, I guess, ourselves or the system at large, which is what's currently missing.
Yeah, and I think this also comes on to a great question that we've had from Marsha at Unheard Voice, that she was asking, what advice would you have for those asked to relinquish working time directives in their contracts and work extra hours for no pay?
Oh, I actually have I think we're in the same group chat that this came up in. I saw this message actually earlier today. So I think this happened when I started my first job, my first part one. When I got set my contract, there was this little nice slip of paper, which was, as well as your contract, you need to sign that you waiver your right that you'll sometimes be working more than, I think it was a 40 or 48-hour week. And if you didn't sign that, in theory, your contract was void. But it's actually optional. Like you don't have to, like the reason you are signing away that right is because that is your legal protection. Like all the protests and work that have been done before about working certain number of hours in a week, doing the 8-8-8 balance, supposedly, of like 8 hours work, 8 hours of sleep and 8 hours of play, was like created for a reason. So you can opt out of that. And actually, I think one of my friends did say that I didn't know this at the time, but yeah, just refused to sign it and said, I don't feel like I don't feel comfortable doing that. And I think you can engage with that kind of dialogue. It's not, if it was something that was inherent to you and your role, I think it would be in the contract. It wouldn't be like this almost like shady little piece of paper on the side saying, please waive away your right to have a 40 or 48-hour work week.
Well, I mean, it'd be great if there are some practices on the call at the moment that might want to sort of give us some insight into those conversations that they've had with part ones as well. I mean, if that's something you'd be comfortable talking about here, it'd be really great to have that perspective. I'm going to give you an easy question first. Well, maybe an easy question, because we've got lots of very complex questions, which may require like one more research and two, another Thursday talk. One was asking about like whether there is a way to confirm that a practice is chartered. I'm about to accept a part one job at a practice that I love, but they are refusing to offer me more than £25,000 in London. I have 18 months experience in practice already. The practice is listed on the RIBA website. Is this definitive proof?
That's a good question, actually. I don't know if there is like a single definitive list which literally just names every practice. It's not like, I mean, like for example, Architects Declare, like when you sign up, there's like a massive landing page where you get every practice that's part of it. I actually don't think one of those places exists, but usually all the RIBA chartered practices obviously are entitled to like use the logo and use the branding. So I would maybe just say look around at what you can find on social media if you can't like definitively know. Like 90% of the practices that are RIBA chartered mention it, and it's like at the bottom of email chains or at the bottom of the footer of the website, or on social media. And you can maybe deduce from that. But yeah, I do agree there. I don't think there is like a proper overview list of, you could just search a name and know if they're chartered or not, which is maybe something that would be useful actually.
Well, is that something that you'd recommend contacting the RIBA to question as well?
Yeah, I will.
Professional standards.
I'll look into that. I'll do some digging and see what I can find.
I mean,
Got some homework.
Of course. I would never leave anyone without any homework, of course, even though you've graduated. There's another great comment in the chat about the transparency and about how it's super important in tackling a lot of these issues, as Pay 100 and FAF have demonstrated. Would you consider lobbying the RIBA to provide a glass door style rating system for all chartered practices?
Yeah, I think that is something that would be really useful to have. I think again the caveat, which is I think the caveat always is they're just so different. Like it's so hard to pinpoint, and even the data that you see from FAF and Pay 100 need to be taken with a pinch of salt, because again it's self-reported. Like all the numbers and figures, you don't actually, like one person maybe is paid, let's say 40,000 as a part two, and is that reflective? Maybe it's actually not how much all of them are paid. So I think in a similar way, having like some kind of like glassdoor system might, I don't know how reliable all of it is. And I guess that's why I think there needs to be some kind of like definitive check or some kind of way to properly assess how this information is collected and gathered. But and then I think it just goes back to time again. Like by the time you've done that, stuff has moved on. Like there'll be new, by the time you've collated all of that data, maybe the numbers have moved up again. It'll be next April, the national wages, will have increased. I don't actually know what the best like workaround for that is, apart from I don't know, maybe coming from a top-down perspective rather than people having to report it. Maybe the practices should have to report it. Maybe that's something that should be made more like pushed externally, as we pay this. Like I think that's one of the big things that I don't know if it was FAF or I remember seeing like quite a big push on social media for actually just putting the salaries on job roles, because quite often they're missed. I don't think there is actually any enforceable guidance or anything that like says you have to declare that, but it's so useful just to know like where you sit, and it going like just applying is such a big like process in itself. It's really reassuring to know where you sit in that.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a conversation with practice we were having the other day that was saying that they didn't put that band on because they wanted it to be open to tell people what their experience was and to go forward and like suggest what they thought their salary should be in respect to that, because it was more multidisciplinary practice. But I think to have that, you've really got to have the confidence in knowing that your numbers are solid and that you have a sense of your own value in order to be able to ask for that in the first place. So really kind of like that idea of transparency and calling upon these other networks of research is going to be essential if people are going to not give you a salary as a way of trying to break down barriers, because otherwise it seems counterproductive. There was an answer that's come into that previous question that we had about how you can find a RIBA chartered practice. If you go to find-an-architect.architecture.com/practices/search, apparently that's a great way to search RIBA chartered practices. So I don't know if someone else can post that into the chat. There's also a couple of interesting questions about like looking outside architecture as well, because Zafir, I know that you're kind of moving across lots of different roles in your career at the moment, and it would be great to discuss this. I'm going to roll two questions into one. First one being that now you've stepped away from architecture practice, are you using these tips to ensure you are paid what you are worth in the education sector? And the other question was, if I can find it now, help. There are so many in the chat that it's quite difficult to find it. Do you want to answer that one while I try and come back to the other? Yeah.
I guess it's a good question. It's quite, I guess, a little bit different because I guess the roles that I'm now in are, I guess I kind of work for three charities, so they're a little bit different. But like Open City, like I mentioned before, has a union, and that like already has been super useful. I've only been there a couple of months, but already it's been like through the union we're able to like have like really productive discussions and able to. It's just a really nice like knowing you can openly discuss stuff and like I think banding is something that we're trying to look into, and I think that only came about because everybody spoke to each other and spoke about it in a union setting. So and the stuff that because even though I was new, we would like review stuff as a group sometimes before we send it upwards. So there's stuff that I've like commented on and like said, oh, I think we should, for example, when the first draft came in, I said like, oh, 2 days ago the living wage went up, so now we need to update all of that. So there's some back and forth that happens because you obviously inevitably miss things, but another reason why unions are quite successful, because on a group level you can do so much more than one person.
And I suppose that also helps with people because architecture is such a pluralistic profession, and the fact that not everyone is going to become a part three like architect. Like, how can we help support people who are moving outside as well, especially as one of the questions is raised, that's saying that higher education fees are so expensive, you're being paid so little as a part one. Like, are there other ways that we can help support this sort of diversifying of architectural education out into other careers too, that it's not just about architecture? And I think that is an interesting point that's raised in that book, Architecture After Architects, Architects After Architecture, about how there are lots of other potential outputs and places that you might work. I'm very mindful of the fact that we've run completely up against time, but there are lots of these other issues that were raised in the Negroni talk last night, that the recording is available online, about fees for free. That was a really great discussion. So hopefully helps unpack some of these answers to the questions we haven't had a chance to get around to. But hopefully, if you have other further questions, please do contact Zafir and help raise those within the RIBA, and we can push for greater change and equity in the profession in the future. But Zafir, thank you so much again for so generously sharing all your research and helping us understand more about how these things work.
Thank you so much. Honestly, email me anytime if anybody has any issues or anything they want to discuss, or grab me anytime if you're an LSA student. Happy to answer anytime.
And please join us again next week when we've got a presentation from Dis Collective, who are going to be talking about exploring valuing disabled spaces, experiences and histories. So please sign up through the website once more, and we'll see you there.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.